Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. It's been a while since I made a video, so I feel like introductions are in order. My name is Oren and behind me is my Scion FRS, which I'm currently in the process of swapping a K24 paired to a CD009 transmission into the car. Now this is going to be part 2 of my K-swap series. In the last video I went over the different transmission options that you can consider when K-swapping your FRS, BRZ, or 86, and in that video I told you guys that I was going to be going with the CD009 transmission. So for this video, we're going to be test fitting the K24 paired to the CD009 using K-Power mounts and a Collins adapter, which I'll have links for in the description below. I'm going to go over the different things that I learned along the way of test fitting this transmission, as well as where it makes contact in the transmission tunnel and all that kind of stuff. So if you're considering this engine swap with the CD009, go ahead and check out this video and I'll give you guys some pointers for what to expect.
So I apologize for the odd angle, but I'm inside the transmission tunnel now, and you can see here is the hole where the shifter goes, and then obviously there's the entrance to the transmission tunnel, and you can see right here all of these kind of circles where I had to drill out the spot welds for the bracing and the transmission mounts that were once here. So as you can see, the transmission is now completely straight. I will go into what areas you need to widen in a second. Even before you go to test fit the transmission, you're going to have to remove all of this bracing and make it so that the transmission is a straight shot in between the entrance and the hole for the shifter.
So 2 other quick notes for getting the K24 and the CD009 into your car. One, it basically is impossible to do this without removing the sway bar. So you can see the sway bar is right there on the ground. We removed it, or at least got it mainly out of the way, so that the adapter plate will have no issues once it gets over the steering rack and will be not stuck by the sway bar. So removing the sway bar is basically a must. And in addition to that, as you can see, we also removed the windshield wiper cowl, basically that black plastic thing that you can see up there. It's just a couple tabs, not a huge deal. I obviously don't have windshield wipers. You don't need to remove the windshield wipers. That's something just I did for weight reduction, but that has nothing to do with the install of the K24 and the transmission. Just a quick note that I realized while editing this, you do have to remove the actual windshield wipers to get the plastic cowl off, but you don't have to remove the motors like I have here. And in addition to that, you can see we kind of bent the cowl or the sheet metal or whatever that is right there. And the reason for that is because on the valve cover there is this breather right here, and it would get stuck there. So in order to make our lives easier, we just bent it, and we'll go ahead and hammer it back into position when we're all done. Now, worth mentioning, the K24 valve cover that comes with the K-Power kit, or at least you can order with the K-Power kit, does remove this breather, so you wouldn't have this problem if you had that head on, but I'm saving that head for once the motor is finally in position, meaning once we're basically done installing and removing it, because I don't want any chance of scratching the nice red cover, and instead I'm just going to use this garbage one that came with it. So after doing some test fitting with the CD009, there are a couple things that I want to note as far as if you're considering using this transmission for the K24 swap. Firstly, this gigantic bell housing right here was a point of great concern for me. I thought that this was going to make contact with the entrance to the transmission tunnel just because of simply how large this bell housing is, but thankfully this does not make any contact with the transmission tunnel. I did hammer one area slightly so that if the transmission and engine move around while driving, it won't make contact then, but this actually worked out really well in that the bell housing did not make any contact with the transmission tunnel. As far as what areas did make contact with the transmission tunnel, as you can see, the rear section of this transmission is quite wide. Specifically, these points right here and right here. Basically, the edges of this back part of the transmission, those are where the transmission did make contact with the transmission tunnel. So you're gonna have to widen the transmission tunnel where this point makes contact and where this point makes contact. And the last area that I widened the transmission tunnel was around this sensor, because this sensor sticks out pretty close to as wide as this point right here, and I didn't want this sensor to make contact with the transmission tunnel, and I also didn't want it to be very painful to put in or take out the wire that goes into this sensor. So those are the areas where you're gonna have to widen the transmission tunnel. There's 3 points right here, and at that sensor. Now, the last thing that I wanted to mention regarding this transmission was the shifter. I had hoped that because the distance between the bell housing and the shifter is shorter than the stock FRS transmission, that this would line up perfectly in terms of where the shifter would be once the transmission is installed. But unfortunately, that did not end up working out. While the shifter is supposed to be about here, the shifter hole, or where the shifter should be once this is mounted in the car, is about here where this kind of U-joint thing is. Thankfully, because the CD009 is a very commonly used transmission, there are a couple of solutions to shorten the shifter length on this transmission, so I ordered one of them. and I'll let you guys know if it works. It mounts the shifter about 85 millimeters back from these holes, which should be about where the U-joint is, and I'm hoping it'll line up perfectly, but more on that once I install it. Now, as far as widening the transmission tunnel, the old classic option for widening the transmission tunnel would be to use a hammer and basically just hit the tunnel until it widens. But if you want to use a little bit of science, one option would be to use a car's jack, meaning the jack that comes with your car to jack up the car if you have a flat on the road, and widen the transmission tunnel using the force of the jack. So as you can see, I have it right here mounted in the transmission tunnel. This is one from an S2000, though you can use one from an FRS or BRZ that comes in the car. So here's another angle of the jack expansion of the transmission tunnel. So as you can see, we have the car jack right here, widening the transmission tunnel. We have a piece of wood helping keep the jack straight, because if we didn't have this piece of wood, the jack would just want to slide down because of the angle of the transmission tunnel. And then in addition to that, we have this jack stand holding up the piece of wood so that the propensity for the wood in the jack to want to slide down in the transmission tunnel is stopped and it's held in place. So basically, I'm just expanding the jack slightly and then letting the metal sit and then expanding it further until we get it wide enough to where we believe the CD009 will fit nicely. In terms of transmission mounts, one of the options is to use the mounts from the TF Works kit, which is specifically for the K24 swap into the FRS BR086 using a CD009 transmission. Obviously, I can't comment on how well that fits with using the K-Power mounts because they weren't necessarily designed to go together, but I imagine that it might fit or would fit with a little bit of modification. The solution that I'm going with would be using a Sicky transmission mount. It is originally meant for using the CD009 with an LS swap into the FRS BR086. I ordered it before the TF Works kit came out. I probably would have gone with the TF Works mount if that was available at the time that I purchased it, but it was not. But I assumed that I could make the Sicky mount that is meant for the CD009 but for a V8 swap. I thought that I could make that work, and thankfully it appears that I can make it work. So as you can see, I have the Sicky mount mounted to the bottom of the transmission, and that kind of section right there goes into this hole, and then this hole attaches to the mounts which are currently mounted in the transmission tunnel. It's kind of hard to see because of how dark it is, but you can see them mounted there and there. I'm going to test fit the transmission, and so long as it fits and mounts up to those mounts, I'm going to go ahead and weld those to the transmission tunnel. The nice thing about these mounts is that they do use bolts to hold on. You're not supposed to, or you don't have to weld them to the transmission tunnel. So if you don't know how to weld or don't have a welder, this is a pretty easy solution for you. But just for some added strength, assuming that these line up with the transmission once it's mounted, I am going to go ahead and weld them just to make sure they are extra strong. So we did another test fitting with the K24 and the CD009, and I can confirm everything has worked out so far. We've got the shifter installed. This is a reduced length shifter from GK Tech, and it fits really well. As you can see, it's very centered in the hole for the shifter, and it feels really good. I'll have a link for this in the description below, but I definitely recommend this if you're doing this swap. So we got the shifter figured out, and we also have the transmission mounts figured out. So as you can see, we have the transmission mounts holding up the transmission. It's currently held up by the bolts. Like I said, it is normally meant to be held up by bolts, but I will be going ahead and welding it soon since we know that it fits. I also measured for the drive shaft. I'm not going to tell you guys what the measurement is because you guys should probably measure your own to make sure that you order the correct size drive shaft, since this is going to require a custom drive shaft for the time being. But I'm going to go ahead and get that ordered and get these mounts welded. So I think that's going to do it for this video. We've got the CD009 in there mounted. It's completely being held up by the transmission mounts, and it fit really well. It took a little bit of modification of the transmission tunnel, which I showed you guys, but not nearly as much as I was scared it was going to take. The bell housing fits perfectly. Everything is looking good so far, and I'm very happy and excited for where this project's going to go next. The next video is probably going to be talking more about the engine in terms of getting my custom exhaust built, getting the wiring harness built, and all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned for those videos, and stay tuned for hopefully soon we'll be on the track to see how this all feels. Thank you guys so much, and have a good one.